Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, that we may walk in his paths. The nation's Ninth of Av invites you to join us in the conversation of Christians and Jews walking together in fulfillment of God's covenant promises. Welcome back to another Nation's Ninth of Av interview segment. Our guest today from Israel is Rabbi Tuly Weisz. Tuly, welcome to the program. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Al.
Now, you have been a partner with the Nation's Ninth of Av from the beginning, I think, and you've done so through the offices of Israel 365. So let me just start there. What is Israel 365 and how did it come about?
Israel 365 is a daily connection to Israel for Christians all over the world. We have a website and we're active on social media, but it's primarily a email newsletter that goes out every day to 300,000 subscribers with a connection to Israel. So there's a Bible verse every day, and our foundational scripture is the verse that says that Israel is a land like no other land. It's the land that God's eyes are upon from the beginning of the year until the end of the year, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 12. And when I read that verse, it really occurred to me that it's like the only time in the Bible that it really describes what God does every day from the beginning of the year till the end of the year. And his eyes are focused on Israel. God connects with Israel. He looks at Israel. He loves Israel. And so Israel 365 is your daily connection to Israel as well. And we have a Bible verse and a photograph of Israel, and then a lot of interesting news items that are particularly of interest to evangelical Christians that show how Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and how the news that is happening in Israel every day is really right out of the Bible. Can't really understand the Bible without looking at the news that's coming out of Israel, and you can't really understand the news that's coming out of Israel without looking at the Bible, without appreciating the Bible.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you went straight there to Deuteronomy 11. That's one of my favorite passages, but it gets to the identity of the Jewish people, which is the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the Torah. And you have just put it all there together in one package.
Exactly. Yeah, everything that we do tries to honor the God of Israel, the land of Israel, and the people of Israel. I started it because I was living in America at the time, and kind of as most Jews are, living in a Jewish bubble, didn't really have any appreciation or understanding really of the non-Jewish world, and certainly didn't know that there were Christians out there who really loved Israel. I thought all Christians kind of were anti-Semitic. I thought all Christians wanted to hurt the Jewish people, and that was just sort of how I was raised. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and so Christians were sort of like always a threat, scary. They were always like the enemy, unfortunately. And I think a lot of Jewish people are not exposed to Christians today who really love Israel. And so for the first time in my life, I met Christians who were interested in Israel. And so it was very new to me, but I started building relationships, and they asked me to teach. And I would, first I was like, well, why would Christians want to hear a rabbi teaching? And it just opened up my eyes to the fact that we were living in a unique time, in a unique generation.
Yeah, what you have just said is, I could say the same from my side, growing up in a Christian bubble and didn't have much interaction with Jews other than my pediatrician, the deli down the street, but as we have moved toward this place where our different worlds intersect, what are some of the key points that are surprises that you have found about Jewish-Christian relations and maybe what we share in common?
Well, I mean, the surprise was, number one, that there were, in fact, that we were really in a unique time, that like, the Christians of today are not like the Christians of previous generations. And I think that was a surprise to me, and that's still not known by most of the Jewish people. Then it was surprising once I started building relationships how much I had in common, how much we as the Jewish people have in common with Christians. We both love the Bible, we both love the God of Israel, we both love the land of Israel, and we're studying the same Holy Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. So that was surprising to me. I kind of knew that, yeah, well, Christians have the Old Testament, but they really just are focused on the New Testament and the Old, and so that was surprising to me that Christians really do love the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's still surprising to me. Um, there's still so much that I think we need to learn about each other. After 2,000 years of walking on separate paths, now that our paths are coming together, there's still a lot of learning that we need to do, how to be sensitive to one another. I'm so appreciative of what you and the whole Nations Ninth of Av team is doing by really sensitizing the Christian world as to the history of persecution, Christian anti-Semitism. I think that is going a long way to help Jews understand that Christians today are not even aware of the history. And so, we kind of assume that, well, Christians not only are aware, but are kind of proud of their history. Everybody, for the most part, takes pride in their history. And so I think that most Jews would assume that Christians know their history and it's part of Christian history, and that they're proud of it to some extent. And so I think that what you're doing is by calling out the anti-Semitic episodes and saying, that this is something that we need to confront. And so, to me, that's a very reassuring. And I'm somebody who's deeply working closely with Christians on a daily basis. But for most Jews, that would come as a total surprise.
Yeah, I can see where that's a surprise. And you are right in that we don't know our own history. You mentioned your grandparents who are Holocaust survivors, and we really don't have a frame of reference in the Christian world for that. I look at my background, and my family 4 generations ago lived through the Yankee occupation of the South after the Civil War, and dealt with that. Before that, they left Scotland because of English oppression, but that's the distant past. And everyone can talk about something like that in their distant past if they know it. But what I'm finding is that for Jews, it's right here in front of you every generation. And if it's not the Holocaust, then it's anti-Semitism rising again in France, or it's the constant threat of Iran, or before that, it's being expelled from one country after another.
Right. And also, I would even say that, like your history, for example, with the Civil War or the Scottish expulsion, I think sound like, I don't want to assume that I know too much about your background, but sounds sort of like, isolated, pattern, not a pattern, whereas the Jewish history of persecution is the pattern that follows us through in every generation. And so that is our history. It is a history that is full of persecution. And so we look at what's going on today, or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, as just the latest in the pattern. And again, what is entirely counterintuitive and breaks the pattern is the fact that for the very first time in history, you have not isolated, but millions of non-Jews who are saying that we stand with you, and we love you, want to support you, and that is something that is surprising at the least.
Which I suppose brings us to the nation's Ninth of Av. How did you become aware of this initiative and get involved?
Well, I've known Bob Odell for a number of years, since he was working with Gidon, Ariel on Root Source, and we collaborated on that, boy, 5, 6 years ago, probably. So I've known Bob for a while. We've had him over at our house for Shabbat with his wonderful wife. And so I don't know when exactly I heard about the nation's Ninth of Av, but immediately I wanted to be a part of it and support it in any way that I could.
Now, we have, as you have mentioned, there are millions of Christians around the world who love Israel. We may not know exactly why or what that means, but this is a move of God. As you know, I've participated in a March of the Nations at Sukkot in Jerusalem, and that's just a sight to see. But what is there, if anything, different about the nation's Ninth of Av from Christian Zionism that has been a growing phenomenon for the last many years?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of Christian Zionism is focused on the positive messages, the great miracles that are happening out of Israel, the innovation, Aliyah. There's a lot of ministries that were built around supporting Aliyah. A lot of organizations are focused on these more uplifting and positive and inspirational sides of Israel. And what makes the nation's Ninth of Av unique is that you are not afraid to embrace the most negative messages of Christian anti-Semitism, and to say that we want to connect with the Jewish people precisely because of those painful episodes, and we want to address that head on. And I think that's really brave, courageous. A lot of, I guess, Christians don't want to go there, which I would understand, but it's very courageous of you that you're making that such a central part of your mission. And I think that is so important because really to understand the Jewish people, you have to understand the Ninth of Av. It's not enough to understand Shabbat or to understand Jerusalem. You got to understand the Ninth of Av. You got to understand that to this very day, Jews all over the world are sitting on the floor and they're crying and they are mourning over the temple. And not only that, they're mourning over all of the episodes of anti-Semitism. So many of them are Christian anti-Semitism throughout the 2,000 years of our history. And to understand the Jewish people, you got to understand the Ninth of Av. And so I believe that by building this Ninth of Av, the nation's Ninth of Av movement, and the day where more and more Christians are participating, are fasting, are standing with the Jewish people on the Ninth of Av, precisely those of you who are doing that are going to have the strongest connection to the Jewish people as a result.
Let me probe that a little further, Tuly. You are right, as I'm coming to understand, learning the centrality of the Ninth of Av, why Jews still observe the day, is important. And you mentioned mourning the temples. But could you unpack a little bit, for those who don't know, what is the source of your grief each year? More than just loss of the temples and all these terrible disasters that befell the Jewish people. What is the source, and what is your hope that comes out of it?
Well, the source, and you might know this, the source for the ninth of Av actually goes even before the destruction of the first temple. It is alluded to in the book of Numbers when the spies go out to spy out the land. They're on the verge of entering Israel. They come back with a negative report. And it says that the nation cried on that night in Numbers. And the Jewish interpretation of that, and the sages, the rabbis teach, that was the ninth of Av. And God was so heartbroken that the people had rejected the gift that he was looking to give to them, the gift of Israel, the land of Israel, that he basically, kind of cursed that day and said that I'm going to give you a reason to cry, and this is going to be your cursed day, on your calendar forever. And that was the day that the first temple was destroyed, and that was the day that the second temple was destroyed, and a lot of calamities took place on the ninth of Av. And so if you go back to that very first episode, so what's happening there, and what the source of our mourning, the source of all of our pain, is the lack of proper appreciation for Israel, number one, and therefore the lack of a proper appreciation for God would be number two, and the harming the relationship with God and the distancing with God. When we lost our connection to Israel from that first ninth of Av, when we didn't immediately go in and take the land that we should have done. So every ninth of Av was a loss of the connection to Israel. Certainly after the destruction of the temple, which was God's presence on earth and God's home, so to speak, on earth. And when that was lost, our relationship with God really suffered as a result. And so, everything follows that same pattern, that the source of all of our troubles till this very day, and I don't even mean on a national level, on an individual level, as people, is when we are cut off from God, when we are distant from God. And so that's really what the ninth of Av is about. However, I think that a lot of the Jewish community has focused on that message, but abandoned the message about, well, the ninth of Av is also really about Israel and about the rejection of the land of Israel. And again, I think that the Jewish people, over the last 2,000 years of exile, we've moved away from Israel as being like an achievable, attainable, physical homeland for our people. And we've kind of like turned it into a myth, turned it into a symbol. But now that thank God, the real opportunity to return to the physical land of Israel. So a lot of the Jews in the Jewish community, a lot of Jews are still like, haven't caught up to that. And sort of like, replacement theology in some kind of weird way, that, Christians have also turned Israel into a symbol and not recognized that, no, it was always very physical. It was always very literal. And the last, 72 years of Israel's history, we're still kind of catching up. We're still catching up with that.
Yes, we certainly are. But this is an exciting, hopeful time, which as we get to the end of our time together, I want to ask you one final question, Tuly. You'll be one of our presenters at our virtual Ninth of Av gathering in Jerusalem this year. What do you hope to see moving forward from that gathering?
Well, it's always, one way to always, gauge success and influence is just by the the number of participants, and I've always, just been so impressed how each year it seems like, your numbers are growing. So I hope that I pray that the numbers continue to grow so that more people are touched by your message. It's an important one. And I just hope and pray that God continues to open up more hearts to understand each other, that the Jewish people, we have a lot that God needs to open our hearts so that way we can embrace support from Christians who love Israel without all of that trauma and anxiety that is hard to sometimes leave at the door for the Jewish people. And I hope that more Christians also really, that their hearts are opened to coming closer to the Jewish people in sincere friendship, without strings attached, and without sort of a proselytizing agenda, which again, just recently we had a flare up about that. And that's really damaging to, I think, the bridge that we're trying to build between Jews and Christians. So just hope that God helps us to navigate this and opens up more hearts on both sides.
Would you say that the path we are walking takes a great deal of faith for the Almighty to work His will beyond our expectations?
Absolutely, because it's not logical. It's not even, it's very easy for a person to look at what's going on with all of the Christian support for Israel today and be cynical about it. And again, there was a really painful episode just recently where a Christian cable television channel was attempting to reach Israelis and proselytize and convert, that. So there's still a lot of reasons for cynics to dismiss the progress that we are making between Jews and Christians. But we know that God has a plan, and we know that, and we have to have faith that those who are sincere on both sides will ultimately be successful, because I think that, as a parent, when you see there's nothing that is more heartbreaking than when you see your kids fighting with each other. And then there's really nothing that brings a parent more joy and more pride than when their children who were fighting on their own start to make up. And so I do believe that this is part of God's plan, and God wants us to make up, and God wants us to play nicely together.
I am in full agreement. And that is a great word to end our conversation. Rabbi Tuly Weisz of Israel 365, thank you very much for sharing your time and your heart. And I look forward to meeting you in person in Israel very soon.
Thank you, Al. And thank you for everybody for participating in the nation's 9th of Av.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about the nation's 9th of Av and how you can be part of the conversation, visit us at 9-av.com.